name is Carissa Persico, and today we have a great session focused around emulating and detecting Kerberoasting. And, spoiler alert, we're going to be talking shop with a very special guest. So let's get into it. So I am a senior incident handler here at Red Canary, and joining me today is my awesome teammate, Paul Michaud, also on the incident handling team, along with the CEO of Red Siege and godfather of Kerberoasting, Tim Medin. So Tim, we've given you this name of godfather of Kerberoasting, but I was wondering maybe you can add a little context into how your name got so tightly entwined with Kerberoasting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about the Godfather thing. I mean, I haven't put any hits out at anybody, no horse heads in anybody's beds that we can talk about. No, so I mean, I was lucky enough to I don't know, figure out Kerberoasting. I can't say it's any particular set of skills. It was just spending some time digging into the protocol, into the RFCs, which is, a little bit tedious, but just kind of lucked into a neat little attack. And frankly, I thought this was going to be dead years and years and years ago, but we'll talk more about that, and it keeps on living. So happy to talk about it some more.
Excited to dive in and pick your brain quite a bit. So today we're going to not just talk about Kerberoasting and what it actually is, but also how to detect it reliably. We'll also get a chance to get some of those firsthand experiences from Tim as we talk about how adversaries actually use Kerberoasting. And then we'll show you how to launch a Kerberoasting test using Atomic Red Team framework. So Tim, I'm going to hand this over to you. Just again, you kind of have the most experience here out of all of us, maybe. What is Kerberoasting? How would you describe it?
Yeah, so it's I mean, at the time it was, I hate to say it because it was pretty innovative, but it sounds sort of self-promoting. But the neat thing with Kerberoasting is it takes advantage of, I mean, the fundamentals of the Kerberos authentication protocol, which is used predominantly with the Windows domain, right? One of the pieces, and I think we're going to get into the details here in just a moment, but it allows you to attack accounts and services, more so the accounts. I keep kicking my camera. That are deep inside the organization where, frankly, Steve in accounting, Sally in marketing, whatever it might be, won't have access to like a database server, but you can attack that account. And frankly, any of the service accounts inside the organization. So that was kind of the big, I hate to say game changer, but it was a significant difference where you could reach way into the organization, even as just some typical low-level user.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, there's definitely a big thing here in terms of adversaries having a very large opportunity to move laterally within a network and gain additional privileges there, and basically further their action on objectives, if you will, I guess. So we'll kind of outline the roasting process, if you will. And honestly, I kind of just have to ask, where did the name Kerberoasting come from? Like, did you have some sort of inspiration there, or did it just kind of come to you?
Yeah, the name, I don't know. It just seemed like a logical, the Cerberus, Kerberos guards the gates of hell. It keeps the damned in. And roasting, I don't know. It just flowed. It was just random luck. It wasn't like I was smart and picking the name or anything. But the process here is, and there's much longer talks on this subject. We'll try to be relatively brief here. But when you want to connect to a service inside the Windows domain, your computer is going to figure out, hey, what is the name of that service? So for example, it will be like and I'm going to probably mess up the name, the MS SQL SVC, that is what's called the service class / and then the name of the computer. That, for all intents and purposes, is the name of the target service. So what we're going to do is request a ticket for the service. Now, the neat thing is with Kerberos, and what makes Kerberoasting even more effective, I can request a ticket for anything, because the domain controller isn't going to decide if I have access. It says, hey, here's a ticket. Let the target service decide. So I can request these tickets for anything. Now, I would like to get a ticket that is crackable. What is that going to mean? Well, the service ticket is encrypted using the target service's password hash. Okay, so I can request a ticket for anything, take those tickets, perform offline cracking, and if a human has picked a bad password, I now have access to that service. I could log into that. The very first Kerberoasting attack, unless it was done in some sort of classified environment, was done under fire, was done by Ethan Robish at Black Hills. I wrote the tool. I wanted to test it. I contacted a good friend of mine, John Strand. I said, hey, you got anybody on a test right now that could try something out? He did it, pulled it back, pulled the tickets down, cracked it with my frankly terrible cracker, and got domain admin. Turns out the SQL server, that account was running as domain admin. So it allowed escalation quite literally to the top of the castle. And then had the interesting situation of not knowing how we got there and not being able to explain to the client because the attack wasn't public yet. So I was like, Ethan, find another way in. Don't burn my technique yet. I need to save it for a talk. But it's now an offline attack. As Carissa mentioned, once I get this ticket, I can take this offline. There's no lockouts. I mean, how often do people change service accounts, passwords? Frankly, never. So we can perform this offline attacking for a very, very long time. As Carissa mentioned, we could then log into a number of systems with that account, at least probably directly back into the system where the ticket came from. It might have broader permissions, like I mentioned with domain admin. The other option is what's called a silver ticket attack. So with a silver ticket attack, remember this service ticket is encrypted using the password hash of the target service. We now have that, right? We have the password. We can generate a hash. We can now create a new ticket. I also mentioned before that the target service, not the domain controller, decides if we have access and what level of access we get. So I can create a new ticket now and say, oh yeah, this is still Tim, but Tim is now a domain admin. So we can get elevated access on that particular system as well. And things like database servers, super interesting, right? Because I mean, the data is there. So that's sort of Kerberoasting in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's perfect. So you were talking a little bit about silver ticket attacks, right? And Kerberoasting is just one of many different attacks on the Kerberos authentication protocol. But I'm kind of curious here, like, it seems like there's a lot of factors at play, right? So are there scenarios where things happen and something doesn't go as planned and you need to maybe shift to a different attack technique? What might go wrong during like a Kerberoasting attack or something similar against Kerberos?
Yeah, other than some of the detections, which we'll talk about a little bit later, the big one is, and realistically, this is good for defenders, is not finding crackable tickets. So one of the things with those SPNs and the underlying service account is there's actually two types of accounts. There's a user account where a human is going to set the password. We also have computer or machine accounts where Windows in the domain randomly generates that password. And of course, then therefore the password hash. Those machine accounts are not realistically crackable. So if I can't get an SPN tied to a user type account, the attack is sort of dead. And realistically, most of this attack just relies on having a crackable credential. So, I mean, it's as simple as setting a good password for these service accounts, which is why I thought this was going to be dead in 2016, but here we still are. We still have those bad credentials floating around. Bad meaning poor passwords, right? Other than that, it's an attack we do typically pretty early. As we mentioned before, all it requires is a single account. A low-level user, right, can request these tickets. We need other tools to then extract those tickets and, of course, then do our offline cracking. But this isn't something where you have to be way at the end of your pen test attack, whatever it might be, before you can execute this. This is, as soon as I get the first account, we can perform this attack.
Nice. So that's a good transition into talking about defenses. So like, how can we as defenders know what to look for and ingest certain data sources accordingly, right? So there's two different avenues here, it seems like. So one of them being the behavior of tickets that are running around in Kerberos. So it seems like it should be considered pretty unusual for a user, especially someone who is not an administrator or is, has nothing really to do with managing Kerberos, to be requesting a high number of tickets within a short period of time. And we talked about this earlier, right, about the different encryption types and encryption strength, but requests for specific ticket types, that being the hash being an RC4 encryption as opposed to AES, being a good target for an adversary to perform Kerberoasting on, just because it makes it a lot easier to perform that password cracking. And then we also talked earlier about open source tools and the tool usage that happens during Kerberoasting. So we'll see this later in some of the atomic tests, but a few, just to name a couple, again, not exhaustive, but Rubius, Mimikatz, PowerShell, Empire, just a few. We'll get an idea of what artifacts those actually leave behind and what they look like in real time with Paul. So diving a little bit deeper into the types of telemetry that we can use, Kerberos isn't something that we can 100% prevent, right? But there's a few different mechanisms that we can use to detect it more accurately. One of those things being Windows event logs, so actually tracking the operations within Kerberos, ticket requests, those types of things. Next being Sysmon, endpoint detection and response software, basically giving you more visibility into activity that's happening right on the endpoint. So think processes running, file modifications, command line tool usage, things like that. And then of course we have PowerShell logs. So PowerShell logs being a really strong method for identifying module loads, command line activity, much more related to that that we'll see in some of these tests. One thing to note here is that not all of these logging mechanisms are enabled by default, right? So it can be really easy to miss one and suddenly not have a lot of visibility into detecting Kerberoasting. The other thing is that some of these telemetry ingestion can be very noisy. So it's a good idea to ingest this into like a SIM. That way they're more queryable, actionable. You're not chasing your head around just trying to figure out what data you're actually looking at. I'm going to pass it over to Paul here to talk a little bit more specifically about the event IDs and some of the logging mechanisms that we have available to us here.
Yeah, thanks, Krista. So kind of breaking down what we just laid out is the Windows event logs 4768 and 4769s are going to be the first ones that we're going to want to look at. When we're focusing on, regardless of what technique or tool that's going to be used to actually execute Kerberoast or identify SPNs or Kerberoastable accounts, we want to look at things in the domain controller or KDCs that are going to collect this and ship them somewhere. So in this case, as Carissa alluded to, these aren't turned on by default. So you have to enable these and set GPOs. If you have single domain or if you have multiple domain controllers, you're going to need to set the GPO to enable these specifically. Next is Sysmon or EDR. Well, it's trivial to change some of these tools by process names or go in memory, which we'll touch on later. There is still potential, and we see common adversaries day-to-day still dropping tools as is right off of GitHub, executing with the default parameters and still seeing success with them. So we can utilize EDR to an advantage in this case, as well as PowerShell logs. So we can, again, we're going to have to do some additional work to collect these logs, and they are generally quite noisy, but they do provide a trove of data that we can use for detection optics as well. In this case, transcript logging, module logging, and script block logging, which we'll touch on in some of our Atomic Red Team tests.
Awesome, thank you, Paul. So pivoting into Atomic Red Team, if you haven't heard of it, Atomic Red Team is basically a library of really simple tests to assess your team's defenses. So they're super focused, they have very few dependencies, and they're also structured in a format so that you can integrate them with automation frameworks. So we're going to take a look at a few different tests here. Note that they are out of order for the sake of this video, just to present them in a more organized fashion, and some have been omitted. But we're taking a look at specifically MITRE technique T1558.003, which maps directly to Kerberoasting. So as we prepare for our first test, which leverages a Windows system internal tool called setSPN, we'll get an idea of what it looks like to extract every single service principal name like Tim was alluding to earlier, to get an idea of what you're looking for a potential Kerberoasting target.
All right, so first test, SPN. So SPN is a built-in utility that is used for adding, querying, modifying, deleting SPNs within a domain. This specific test from Atomic Red Team is basically just going to go say, hey, give me a list of SPNs and return them back. So Tim, from a Red Team perspective, is there an advantage to, whether it's via LDAP or set SPN, basically getting a list first to identify specific targets versus just invoking Kerberoast against the entire domain?
Yeah, so it goes back to one of your points before, where one of the detections is to look for excessive requests for service tickets or weird requests. It takes additional tooling to do this, to have the profiling to know that Steve in accounting, Sally in marketing aren't requesting or shouldn't, or don't normally rather request these tickets. So it's good to know what's out there so that I can maybe cherry pick some of these, maybe go a little bit slower. One of the easiest detections, or easier, I should say, is to look for that massive quantity of ticket requests. And if we can be a little bit lower and slower, a little bit more of a sniper for those tickets, it can definitely help us be a little bit more stealthy.
Right on. Thanks for the clarification and aspect. So we're going to run the first test against our domain. Again, just using set SPN. Now, once we get the results, are there specific accounts that we're looking for? I know earlier we mentioned MS SQL, but are there specific accounts you generally look for, or accounts that you generally try and stay away from?
Yeah, so great list here. So if we look at the list, you'll notice here the SQL one right at the bottom. That stands out to me immediately. There's a couple of reasons. One is there's data in them there hills, right? If I'm an attacker, this is where I want to get. The important data is going to be there, right? From a ransomware perspective, I take this thing offline, significant impact, right? If I'm trying to steal information as an attacker, no. And I say that as the true bad guys, if you will. This is going to be a treasure trove. As a pen tester, this is where I want to go to demonstrate that risk. You'll also notice here, you'll see the first, the OU there for the SQL server. This is in the user's OU. This means this was a human created account, and the password is much more likely to be crackable, right? Because a human picked it. And what I've seen too is a lot of times these accounts, especially service accounts, especially for something as important as a SQL server, these passwords are literally not changed for decades. And there was an S at the end of that. I have seen accounts that are exceptionally old and passwords are exactly as secure as you expect that. On the reverse here, we've got a few others, like the one right above at the exchange. You'll notice it's in the servers and computers. That means that the domain has generated this and it's tied to the underlying computer account. Realistically, not going to be crackable. So I don't want to waste my time grabbing this, pulling it down and cracking when realistically it's not going to be crackable. The other ones we see, I see users right above that with Ansible. Ansible is an interesting service, also tied to the user account. So first off is it tied to a user account? That is a go, no go. After that, it's picking the tickets that are most likely to give us access to the widest or the most sensitive information.
Awesome. Great context. So after we just launched the test, one of the things we need to do now is, cool, we launched Atomic Red Team test. Now we need to look at the data. We need to figure out where we can look for detection. So currently we're shipping these into Splunk. You're going to see some pretty terrible Splunk queries. So for any of my Splunk friends, I apologize. These are not going to be great in any capacity, but they're showing us the starting points, right? We want to start, look at what we have, and then start to narrow our focus. If we try and just target specific things, chances are we're going to miss. And of course, you need to look at the organization that you're testing this in, right? Every org's different. Baselining is going to be super important when you're trying to look at how you can detect this within your environment. So the first thing we see, which we touched on earlier, 4769, and we're looking at the encryption type of OX17, and then we have specific ticket options. Very common. So if we expand one of these out, we can see here, this is coming right off our domain controller. We get the account name of who requested it. We can see the service name that was requested, and then of course our ticket options. So this is a good starting point. We can kind of see and start to get an idea of where we're going from this. So that's on the domain controller, right? The KDC. But now we want to look and see, can we determine if an attacker was on our monitored endpoint and we have something like a sysmon or an EDR, can we detect it? Potentially, yes. Right, so let's take a look at another one. So in this case, we're looking for set SPN execution, and then we're trying to gather some data surrounding it. So in this case, we can see, again, the user that executed it, the parent process, in this case being PowerShell, which we just saw, set SPN being the process name, and then the command line parameters. So super basic detection, again, very trivial to change, or if we do something like a Cobalt Strike or Covenant, which we'll do later, showing in-memory execution, which would evade some of this. But a good starting point is, again, we've seen this being just adversaries coming in, running command exactly like this, and still catching that type of activity, so it's still technically valid.
Cool, thank you, Paul. So atomic test number 3 gave us a good idea of what it looks like to see all service principal names. Now that we have an idea of what we're looking for and what is a good target, we can move to test number 2, test number 4, to request a single service principal name using PowerShell.
In this case, we are going to be purely using built-in PowerShell for this test. So it's going to set a few parameters, and then we're going to specifically target in our test. It's going to look at the computer FDQN, which is set right above, specifically looking at the logon server. So in our case, it's going to be our domain controller. So in the first example, again, we're using built-in utility. This time we're going to use PowerShell. Very easy to leverage and execute. So let's kind of step through each one here. Yeah, so in this case, again, we're looking specifically at the HTTP count for the domain controller. From your perspective, Tim, is there anything interesting relating to this particular return based on what we executed for this test?
Yeah, the nothing super that sort of sticks out here. I mean, I would have to look back above, and I don't necessarily see that one above. The HTTP is a little interesting because the way the app pools work, you can still crack just the same. And I've seen plenty of times where that account will give you access to the database. The silver ticket attack won't work against HTTP, that service class, because of the way app pools work. But crack away on these tickets.
Right on. So again, EDR, because we're inside of an interactive session, sometimes not going to have that collection. However, if we have PowerShell module logging enabled, we can then start to look at it. So specifically, we're going to look at kind of 2 specific pieces of data here. So 4103 and 4104 is going to be our module and script block logging. And then we're going to be looking at specifically, which is an interesting one, the module for the Kerberos requester security token. So as you can see here, we have a few examples already. If we pull them up, we kind of get a lot of information tied to it, and we can start to kind of see what potentially was executed. The other thing we have is the script block logging, or excuse me, the transcript logging. So what was typed into the terminal and then what was returned. So exactly just like we saw earlier, we can now see the output that potentially the attacker had, or the threat actor, or in our case, our atomic test, what actually got returned, which is going to be useful for detecting as well. So kind of 2 quick examples to start with this built-in PowerShell commands from Atomic Red Team test.
Thanks, Paul. All right, 2 down, 2 to go. So now we're going to take a look about a specific tool, in this case, Rubius. Rubius is a C# based tool, which primarily is used for interacting with Kerberos in general. But we're going to see how we can use a specific module within Rubius to actually launch a Kerberoasting attack.
All right. Using Rubius, one of my favorite tools, along with the Ghost Pack suite. Tim, have you ever used Rubius? Is it a tool that you leverage in assessments often?
Yeah, fantastic tool. I very much like this tool. The neat thing about it is it takes a lot of the various Kerberos attacks way beyond what we're just talking about today and wraps it into one tool. The predecessors were all written in PowerShell. PowerShell's fantastic. But as we saw, some of the PowerShell logging as an offensive person can get me caught. So moving to C#, oftentimes I get around a lot of that logging. It's also a lot easier to run it in memory. Highly recommended this tool. In fact, I teach this in my class because I love this tool so much.
All right, this time using Rubius. So we're going to focus on specifically the Kerberos part. So initially we were looking at different SPNs or accounts that we can target. Now we're just going to run this. In this case, it's going to specifically look at all accounts that are available. So not as stealthy, very loud, right? Looking at some of the data we've already gotten. But in this case, there's also two other options, which are going to be RC4 only, as well as TGT delegate, which could be potentially used within Rubius, as well as a plethora of other options or modules to kind of do some Kerberos based attacks. So in this case, we're going to run it, going to have an output to a text file. So we're going to have a few interesting data points here. So in this case, we can see here, gets written out to the output file. So let's jump into Splunk again and kind of take a look at some of our options. So the first thing we're going to look at is rubius.exe. Again, very trivial to change the name and execute it, but we see countless times, again, just downloading the tool and executing it as is with basic parameters. So we can look for Rubius execution. We can also look at the command line parameters that are common, again, Kerberos, TGT delegate, or RC4 OPSEC, and then start to look at some of the lineage, right? So we have PowerShell executing the Kerberos, which then executes command, and then Rubius itself. Another interesting thing we can look for is network connections. So we didn't do it in this particular test, but if you actually run the specific test for Rubius and Atomic Red Team, we'll actually reach out to GitHub, pull down a precompiled binary and execute, so you don't have to worry about it. They don't actually have one in the Rubius repo, but in this case, another data point so that when you're running the test, you look at what's around, what's available. Can I just go grab it? Can I look at the network data as well as the endpoint data? And then the last one being potential files written. So a little bit more harder to use when you're looking for files written, but in this case, again, a valid data point. May not be as pertinent in this particular test, but still a valid option. If you're looking for what process are writing which files, Sysmon and most EDRs are going to give us that data. So we can see if things were written to disk in a file as part of an artifact we can use for collection.
Yeah, one of the interesting things here, and we sort of talked about this a little bit before, is, we saw the execution here, rubius.exe. Now, as an attacker, if you're trying to be stealthier, rename it, but don't underestimate the attackers and the real world attackers and them being to some degree lazy. Is this detection perfect? Absolutely not. Does it work? Does it make you better? Without question. And I see too many times where people say, well, it's not perfect, so we don't do it. No, this is better, right? We want to make ourselves better at finding the bad guys. Perfection is the enemy of good, right? Or what I've screwed up that quote, whatever it is. But some of these basic things will show this kind of craptastic attacker inside your network, and hopefully you can detect and get them out before anything worse happens. So fantastic a scenario here, right? We see attackers all the time using just simple, dumb methods. I've heard of scenarios where the attackers come in and watch YouTube from the compromised system to see how to use a tool. So don't underestimate the non-advanced of your APT here. Still a very valid test.
You bring a good point here, Tim. And I'm just kind of curious here in the engagements that you've done before. Obviously, Rubius is a very powerful tool here, but I'm wondering, do you find yourself, you mentioned a password cracker earlier, do you find yourself writing custom tools or maybe even just custom scripts to help you along the way? Or do you pretty much rely on some of the bigger, more open source tools?
Yeah, so it depends. So one of the things that we want to do, especially with a low and slow type of an engagement, is with a tool like Rubius, Mimikatz, whatever it might be, most of your off-the-shelf defensive products are going to detect that right away. So it might take a little bit of tweaking, changing variable names, the orders in which DLLs are loaded, trying to obfuscate some of that. But it's also a really solid test. One of the things that we do if we aren't caught is we try the simpler thing, because once again, the attackers are going to try simple. Is it perfect just to look for rubius.exe? No. Is it better than nothing? Without question. So we end up doing this a lot, but realistically, a lot of the APT, if you will, don't, right? And I say APT with quotes, not to say that there isn't actual APT, but every organization, every single one without question, in their press release says we were breached by an advanced persistent attacker. And I always question, like, really, how advanced were they? And were they even really persistent? I feel like they were just a T with get a lot of time and being a little bit lazy. Whole sort of different rant here. But sometimes we have to tweak this, but again, many times attackers don't. And again, as a red team or an offensive person on so many levels myself, I like to try, at some point, try these simple things to see, are they caught? Is somebody not only getting the alert, but are they following up on it too, right? That's a whole sort of separate discussion.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that context. All right, and we are on to last but not least, our last test. We are going to get a little bit of visibility into what it looks like for PowerShell and Empire to do some Kerberoasting activity here.
Sorry, getting all of the Splunk queries running because they are going to tank the server that is sitting in my basement. So again, apologies to my Splunk friends. It's probably looking pretty terrible and you're probably cringing, but it gets the job done and that's all that matters. All right, let's share out the screen and we'll get going. So last test. And of course, this is not a complete list of, by any means, the ways to Kerberoast. These are things to get you started, get you thinking about the data that you have. What data even do you have? Are you collecting the right things to kind of just get the ball rolling? So the last one, very common one, Empire framework that's retired from the Spectre Ops team, picked up by BC Security. But let's see what we can do. So now we're going to use, here we go. So again, another PowerShell-based attack, but now we can actually see the tickets that are coming out. So out of this, Tim, from here, we get this, we see this, kind of what's the next step? What's our first thought with these?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing here, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is, you know, a good detection is looking for someone to request too many tickets or different tickets than normal. That's actually harder than it sounds, because when a user first logs in, they're going to request some tickets almost immediately. So tuning that can be a little bit difficult. So again, very valid test. Again, once again, because the attackers 99 times out of 100 are going to just simply request everything at one time. What we see on the screen here are the various tickets. So we've got here the two different tickets here. We've got the SQL one down below and then the Ansible one right above that. This is the ticket. Remember, we talked about this before. The tickets are encrypted using the password hash of the target service. So we can pull these back. We can use Hashcat. We can use John the Ripper. Guess a password, hash it, attempt to decrypt. Do this over and over again. Guess, hash, decrypt until the decryption is successful. At that point, we know the original password that was used for this account. We can use it to log in. We can use it for the silver ticket attack. But what I've got on the screen here is those tickets, right? It's right here. Now, a quick point we discussed a little bit earlier about the encryption method is we can use the RC4. Now, for an attacker, I prefer the RC4 ticket because cracking is quicker. The AES encrypted ticket is not immune from this attack. It just means that the cracking is slower. Both of those keys, if you will, are based on the user's password. So the AES does not fix it, okay? That's an important distinction. So if you want to, as a red teamer, be a little bit more stealthy, maybe you request an AES ticket. Again, just with the awareness that it will take a little bit longer to crack.
Yeah, great points. So if we jump into the data now, kind of the first one we're going to look at, again, going back to our 4103 and 4104, super simple, Kerberoast. Let's kind of see what we got for it. We can then start to see a lot of the information and again, getting the output of those requests. So again, starting point, based on the environment, definitely need some tuning, definitely need some proper searching and regex to extract specific points of data. But now you can see what you get back and then what key points you can actually key off of. Next one, we're going to be looking at the script logging. So if we jump into this is the contents of the script, right? So what we did was we reached out to GitHub, said, hey, go pull the raw script down, pull it down into the PowerShell process, execute it as is. We don't see that, but now what we get with this is the actual output. And we can see the PowerShell script, what actually it contains, and we can use this to key off of. Great data source, again, depending on how much PowerShell and scripting is used, going to produce a tremendous amount of data depending on the size and usage in the organization. And last one, again, transcript logging. We just jump into it, super simple search. Again, seeing the output. So there's kind of some overlap in the data sources, as you can see. But again, we want data. We want potential overlap. If one data source goes missing due to whatever attacker disables it, changes it, manipulates it, right? We need something else to fill in that gap somewhere. So endpoint focus, but again, all of these attacks, we go back to 4768, 4769. The results are going to be the same. Those tickets are going to show up in the domain controller. We can use those for our detection optics on that front as well. Any final thoughts on our last test here, Tim?
Yeah, so if you switch to the second tab there, the one of the interesting things that you did with this attack is you had the client pull the script down straight into memory and execute it. Writing it to disk is a bottleneck where a lot of detection tools are going to see this, hey, look, this file is written to disk, bad things have happened, right? So downloading it straight from a trusted place and running in memory, the interesting thing here is you still have an artifact. It's a different one, right? But it's still a very useful artifact to see that, hey, someone's pulling this file down, never touching disk, and then executing it. So yeah, some great detections here.
Awesome. Thanks for the additional insight into that.
So a few takeaways here, right? So we talked about how Kerberoasting isn't really something that you can just prevent. But with the right logging enabled, it's very, very possible to do some really good early detection. Speaking of that detection capability, it's really important to know how to collect that telemetry and make sure that you're ingesting the right things and know how to search for it. This is where Atomic Red Team can really kick in, give you a better idea of what it looks like to validate the visibility, look at what that detection mechanism is, learn more about the attack itself, and get started in terms of the defensive perspective. If you'd like to learn more, we have a full blog dedicated to all things Kerberoasting. You can just head over to redcanary.com/marshmallows and Kerberoasting. If you want to learn more about the Atomic family, get the repo, or just join the Atomic Red Team community on Slack, you can visit redcanary.com/atomicredteam. Tim, thank you so very much. You've had some awesome insight here. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me.